Hi, Michael and Luke. Good to have you here today to talk about TechnoBabel. So I know people would probably think Babel because that's lots and lots of talk, which is what we tend to do on technology. But today we're talking about Babel because of the Tower of Babel, which is the biblical story. And as I was rereading that biblical story this morning about the Tower of Babel, there were a couple things that stood out to me. One was that in the whole world at that time, there was one language and a common speech. And I thought that was really interesting. And then they said to each other, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And then there's a little kind of parentheses in the text that says they used bricks instead of stone. And they used mortar instead of tar. And I thought, wow. So, because bricks are handmade, right? Bricks are man-made, and stone is something that's already a resource. So I thought that might relate to the whole technology thing too. And then they said, let's build a tower in order to make a name for ourselves and to not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But actually, they ended up doing exactly what they didn't want. They didn't want to be scattered, but they ended up being scattered. So they had a certain purpose in mind and they went after it and they failed. Or what they thought their purpose was actually gravitated against them. So I thought those were pretty interesting points that came up. And then in the very next chapter, after Abraham has been called out of Ur and the Lord is speaking to him, the Lord says, Abraham, I will make your name great, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So in the Tower of Babel, they were trying to make their own name great, but God says, if you follow me, I will make your name great. So I listened to the video that you two did. Did you publish that one? The one that you did on TechnoBabel, the one you sent me?
I don't know that it has been.
No, I don't think so. I think Jeff has it, and so I think it will probably come out at some point, but.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I picked up from that I thought would be interesting to pursue is, Michael, you were saying that some years ago when you first got involved in technology, you had this excitement about the promise of technology, about how it had the promise of being this shining city on a hill. But somehow it missed the mark. And I thought it might be good to explore what was it about the coming technology wave that gave it this idea of being a shining city on the hill, and what were the ways in which it has missed the mark? And is there a way to get back and recapture the promise of it in a worthwhile way and to avoid the mark missing? Or is it just built into the system that it's going to miss the mark?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of how Luke and I maybe see this a little differently is I feel like I don't know. Like I want to be optimistic that there can be some solutions to this, but I don't know. I mean,
Well, before we talk solutions, let's just try to tease it apart a little bit. What was it about it that made it look to you like a shining city on a hill? And then after you answer that, then Luke, you can answer, what was it that you think that makes it miss the mark? Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, what the potential I saw specifically was a sort of democratization of power, moving outwards from traditional power structures to pretty much anybody who had enough care or love to invest themselves in a particular endeavor. Like if you remember the early days of the web, it was amateur everything. You know, it was and there's a certain kind of truth telling that only comes from the amateur, because again, the amateur doesn't have anything to lose. They don't have, as Paul likes to say, they're not on they don't have enough status that there's something they have to worry about losing. Um, and there was enough effort involved, just to put something out there, even from a technical level, that you had to be there was a hurdle to get over. That kind of, it wasn't such a hard hurdle that you couldn't, with a little bit of ingenuity, get beyond it. But it filtered on to people that were really excited about something, and it was a way for people to share that with other people. It was a way for them to coalesce together. It was a way for them to cooperate, um, at scales we hadn't seen before. One of the big things that came out of that I was really excited about at the time is open source software, which I think is slowly kind of going away. If you think about all the big technology companies, Facebook, Google, Apple, even, at the cornerstone of all those big companies is open source technology that was created and then shared into the community for free. And it enabled, it was a way to crowdsource so much technical skill and then share it for free. And it's you couldn't talk about any of the rise of those companies without this kind of base building block of open source software, which was a really cool thing. Another thing, like Wikipedia was something that came out of this, and that was an ability for people with, it provided an organizing structure for people with, you don't have to, like, most people don't spend a lot of time on Wikipedia, but you have this effect of what's known as the long tails, where, like, if you look at the content creators that put edits into Wikipedia, most of them, there's a disproportionate number of people that, the editors that do most of the work, but then you have this long tail of people, like, that will only make a single edit or two. But that tail is so long, so that even people that are relatively uninvolved with the project as a whole, they're able to contribute that into the structure of that thing. So you get this thing that cumulatively was within, like, a matter of years, able to displace every paid product in that category, right? Every encyclopedia that tried to replicate the scale, accuracy, timeliness, of what was present in that product, went away like nothing, with just volunteer labor, essentially, which is really cool. Like, it was, something out of nothing relatively in such a short time. So I think there's the two things I think was, I think the internet was, it was the ability to harness language in a new way, like the human languages that we share, that make, that we interact with and read, but also the technical languages underneath it that, made open source software possible. And it allowed for this huge collaboration, which is essentially, funny enough, a fundamental element of the Tower of Babel. I think that's what I saw as having all this promise.
Oh, that's great, Michael. So, Luke, where did it fall short?
Well,
What did you said you started to think about this like 5, 6, 7 years ago? What was it that first stood out to you as being a problem?
So I guess probably the easiest way that I could say it, and I've been thinking about it ever since when Michael had asked me that question, it kind of caught me off guard right away. I was like, I don't know what even made me start thinking about it. But since then, I've been, mulling that about in my mind. And I think a lot of it was, I think I would affirm a lot of what you were saying, Michael. That was one of my big I was very excited about the onset of the internet too, and even I used to follow it more, but even with like I don't even know what they call it now, like what is it? And I don't even remember what these stand for, but like SOPA and like the what are those laws? There's abbreviations. There's a couple of them about like the it's essentially about how free the internet is and how much they can regulate it and control it within service providers and things. There were a
Net
few laws.
neutrality.
Yeah, like all those sorts of things. I remember following a lot of that because initially when the internet came about, I got into it. I was thinking about it politically, and it really is. The internet was founded, and with the free open source stuff, it was founded to be this neutral place where really like it was completely truly democratic in that sense. But then I think what is my fears with it and with technology in general, I think the danger of them is that they probably the easiest way to summarize it would be that they can become totalizing systems. I mean, that's almost a way that I would think of Babel is a totalizing system. It's something that um, that for whatever reason at some point, and I'm not sure where the shift happens, but it leans toward a monopoly and a totalitarian control, uh, which is where the danger happens, I think. And then the to think about it like biologically, and we talk about this a little bit with ecosystems, is that you need diversity and you need things interacting in a really harmonious way. Like if you think about soil or like a rainforest ecosystem, it has all this stuff that's interacting in a really healthy biological way. But if somehow you were to come in and impose a system upon that, like say in biology, like monocrop farming or something, what that actually does is it destroys ecologies, and it makes you really, in order to systematize stuff, it's like you almost have to really, you have to control all these variables to really emphasize and focus on one thing, you know? So like we can grow corn, we can grow soybeans here, but then like and I think that's the nature of what technology does a little bit. But then the problem with that is it starts to have really wide reaching and long-term negative effects that I think people don't and can't anticipate.
I think
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said totalizing, because there's something about there's a chaos order balance point that gets lost in favor of this order that's and specifically when I say order, I'm also thinking about the group dynamic versus the individual, where this order outstrips the ability for the individual to have an ability to introduce enough chaos to disrupt that order and reform it in constructive and creative ways. And some of that is some of it is it's at a language level where the languages become so particular and specific, and this is really a Barfield thing that he warns about in Saving the Appearances, which is a book that's so prescient it's hard to believe that he wrote it when he did. But it's like the language becomes so particular that like the number of people that can interact with and understand what that language is intended to mean, you know, whether you're talking about the computer languages or human languages, there's so few of them that have that capability that you guarantee that this little area can never be touched, or it kind of becomes ensconced in this negative order. And then the other side of that order that I see as negative too is all the machine learning driven elements of these big companies as well, that are able to kind of outpace, again, the human individual's ability to go seek out what they really want. It's able to kind of capture people's time and attention and resources and funnel it into these kind of non-productive activities that essentially allow them to capture, extra, clicks on their advertising revenue, whether it's, again, Facebook, Google, Amazon, whatever. All of them, what they're really about is using machine learning techniques to get ever more clever ways to trick humans into giving them more time and attention. And so that spark that comes from the individual, the chaos that can be constructive to help reform the order, it's being suppressed.
Wow, Michael, that's so good. So I want to just clarify something that you said at the beginning there when you talked about the language becoming so particular that you guarantee that this particular little area gets ensconced in negative order. Are you saying there that once a language becomes so particularized for a particular, for a specialty, like a certain kind of computer language, that then only a very few people at the top are capable of understanding it, and then they sort of become the ones that are in control of everybody else?
Well, it almost comes to the place I was telling this came up in our talk yesterday. It becomes to the place where there isn't a single individual that's able to make sense of the whole thing. It's not that anybody's pulling the strings any longer. It's almost like the system itself is totalizing to the extent that even the people that think they are pulling the levers have lost. They have a driver's wheel that they think they're turning that does things, but it doesn't anymore, because all the mechanisms in the system that connect the top to the bottom are now broken.
Well, so I was thinking about that when you talked in your earlier conversation. You were talking about a situation in which there were three variables, and each variable was under the control of a certain individual, and those individuals, they knew that there was a problem with the whole system of these three things interacting. So each individual or each team is working on their little part, and they get their part fixed. So all three teams have got their parts fixed, but the whole is still not functional.
Yeah.
because they're misunderstanding the idea. They're thinking that their little piece is complete in and of itself, when actually all of those pieces, the piece itself is not the thing. It's the piece plus its connectivity to everything else that is the thing. So you have these three things, and their connectivity is out in the middle amongst the three of them. It's not
Right, and that's where the meaning lives.
Yeah.
In the relationship between them, but nobody's able to look at that level, because again, the reason it's so divided is because those systems are actually really complicated on their own. And it's, the people that even the person that is, like, let's call it the architect of that system, they are really smart to be able to contain all the knowledge of that system and get it to work well within itself, and to understand all the different parts and how they interact within that one. And so, but there's, again, it's like this, we've reached this tipping point where so many important fundamentals to how things are being operated and decided and moving in terms of the technology and other aspects of society. I think nobody's able to pull back to a level and look at it from a larger perspective, because too much of their, let's say, their memory, their operating memory that they're working with every day is consumed with the detail of their little section of what's going on. And again, especially in the technology space, it's interesting because it's a practical playing out of these scenarios. And also in this particular space, failure and success is you can see very clearly, because with a piece of software, you have to have, like, if some critical element of is off by a single 0 or 1, the whole thing falls. It fails apart. If there's one little aspect that fails in this kind of, gold rubric machine, it all falls apart. And so you get to see very clearly when somebody thinks they understand something and don't, just based on the outcome. You have like a verifiable test where you go, nope, doesn't work. And so I think you see it more clearly, whereas within the human languages and the way this is happening there, it's more difficult to see, for instance, the ways in which we're talking past each other, because there isn't like a definable, or maybe there is a definable thing that we could measure, but we're not looking at it to say, okay, actually this communication attempt between me and Luke or whatever actually failed. We both thought we were, talking and being heard, but it failed because I don't know, I was so laser focused in my head, he was so laser focused in his head, and we didn't actually have any connection in the middle. We were in the particularities of our own kind of narratives and concepts and kind of paradigms for how we look at the thing that are so specific to us. We couldn't meet.
Well, so this points out exactly, one of the things I was thinking about is in terms of our current situation right now with the coronavirus and the steps that are being taken around the world regarding this. It seems so prescient to me that 2 years ago, Jordan Peterson made his way up the fame chain and was able to be visible to a lot of people and make the point to a lot of people that your behavior matters and that your actions demonstrate your values. So like with the software, when you fix something on a piece of software, the failure or success is obvious based on whether or not it works. But we have all these opinions and propositions by which we say we live, but then our actions don't line up with it, but it's not obvious to us. Mm-hmm. And he sort of brought that into the public arena to help people see, wait a minute, my actions aren't lining up with what I say I believe. And if I'm going to be prepared to be a productive, helpful member of society, I need for my actions to line up with what I say I believe. And I've seen that percolate out amongst many, many, many people who've taken on that challenge and really changed their lives because of what he said, which means that right now there are a lot more people out in the public space who are prepared to be of use in their society, in their culture, than were there 2 years ago. And I have to feel like that's not an accident. It's not an accident that there are more people prepared to be heroic in this environment, because we're in a time when that heroic character is so needed.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just thinking this morning of the long list of people that we need to be praying for, the truckers that are moving product, the delivery people, the farmers who have to keep working, and the people who are keeping the lights on and the water running and the gasoline, and all the technology people that are maintaining our connectivity, and all the healthcare workers and the nurses and the cleaners. And
yeah, and I think you were really square to go back to Jordan Peterson and talk about behavior, and specifically what, really at the top of the hierarchy for Jordan is the truth. And this is something, that Luke likes to point out. But it's more subtle than that, because obviously we all have a sort of nominal relationship where we want the truth, right? That's everybody. Nobody wants to live in deception, right? There's a certain just like, everybody wants to know the reality. They might want to deceive other people, but nobody wants to be deceived themselves.
Well, we do and we don't, right? Like if you asked us that, we would say we want the truth and we want reality. But again, we don't act as if very often.
And I think that it's interesting, because I do think, anytime you do engage in deception, you always, there's a certain arrogance in thinking that you can deceive others without deceiving yourself first. Like, to some extent, the effectiveness of my lie relies on how well I convinced myself of the lie first before I tell it. And so, and again, I think that there's such a buildup of lies in our culture right now. You know, and Paul talks about this sort of whoosh that goes through the culture when truth gets, you know, truth comes through and finds the lie, and just it's like the truth just has this gleam of something that's so, you know, it's this spark of reality that just consumes the lie like that. I think that's a lot of what the effectiveness of Jordan was. But but there's a sense in which we don't even know all the times that we don't even know the reasons, and there's such this the lies are is this extra level of complexity into the technobabble, you know.
Okay, so that just gave me a thought. Here's here would be a question that I would propose. It's kind of a question slash, it's just a thing want to put out there. It's an assertion, but it's also just, I'm not saying it's absolutely true. Maybe technology allows us to lie a lot more easily. Because one thing, like if you think about it in Peugeotian terms, in a really simple way, like garments of skin or garments of light, when he talks about even simple with technology, one of the things technology allows us to do is manipulate our world and our environment. So, you know, the reason I can live at this latitude away from the equator is in winter I can wear a coat. You know, it's a technology that allows me to wear a coat, that allows me to survive. And so all these things they allow you in like a sphere, they allow you to work away from a center to a fringe. Even on the globe, that's what you're doing. You're working from the center to the fringe, and technology is what allows you to do that. Technology is what allows us to talk right now from mass distances, where before you were just communicating to your family, people in your embodied presence, but now we can communicate these really long distances. We were talking about this a little bit with reality TV and even social media and Tinder dating and things like that. It allows you to create a profile or an Instagram thing or use a filter where you are essentially lying about the projection of what you are. You're misrepresenting who you really are, and you can do that via technology. If I was face to face with you, I mean, I can do that a little bit. You can do that with makeup, with technology. You can do it with hair gel. You can do it with whatever, clothes, to accentuate things and de-accentuate things. But that's all technology allows for you to do, those kinds of things. And I almost wonder if if you kind of look at my 4 horsemen of technological babble, like with consumerism and materialism, I can buy clothes that are made in a sweatshop, shipped across the world, that have a humongous carbon footprint, that are crated in and traveled in, you know, that are ethically dubious at best. But you can do that via technology, where you couldn't before. You either had to make something or get it locally or live without, or technology allows for you to essentially put a veil up that allows you to, it's not even necessarily active self-deception. It's almost like a transparency is very difficult when everything is so distant from your actual embodied world.
Well,
And so
I don't think that's necessarily a function of technology. I agree with you that distance creates that problem. Because when you were talking about deception, I all of a sudden remembered when I was 12 or 13 years old. I'm very embarrassed to admit this, but when I was 12 or 13 years old, back in the day, they used to have in the backs of the teen magazines, they would have a pen pal section. And there would be addresses of people who wanted to have a pen pal. And so you could start writing to people and get this pen pal thing going. Somehow, I have no idea how I did this. I became a pen pal with some guy who was in the military. I'm 12 years old, right?
Wow.
I didn't want him to know I was 12 years old. And there was no chance I was ever going to meet him. Although, I mean, when I'm 12 years old, I probably have all these dreams. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful, you know? So I sent him the senior picture of my best friend's older brother's girlfriend, because I had her picture. She was like 17. So I sent him this picture of this 17-year-old beauty queen. She actually was the beauty queen.
Mm-hmm.
She had won the Miss Princeton contest that year, and represented myself as being this older girl.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't require technology aside from a postage stamp and a letter. All it required was the deceptive heart, you know.
Right, but
We
even
have
that
this
was
deceptive heart, we
technology.
take it with us wherever we go.
Yeah, but even that was technology, because like outside of the technology of
Photography and
the pencil and the mail system of photography, right? Like
yeah,
it's all a matter of scale, and it's all a matter of
yeah,
the evolution of technology. Michael and I got into that a little bit in our conversation. Like Socrates lamented the proliferation of literacy and writing, because he said it would affect our memory. And we look back on that, and we look back on, oh, I wish, with romanticism, like more people read books and physical books versus whatever, listening to podcasts or just binging Netflix or whatever. But it's all a matter of where are you in that story of the progression of technology. But that gets into my Babel idea that I have. My concern is that will only, I almost think of it as like a pulsing. You could think of it as just like a energy, or the universe like expanding and contracting. Babel, there's only, I think it will only go so far before you get a collapse. I don't think that can go forever, this technology. And I think it will reach such an exponential point that either through a mass plague or disease outbreak that comes as a ramification of technology, or a war, or whatever. I mean, I don't
well, let's
think it
take a
can
look at
continue.
what's happening right now. The thing I noticed happening with technology in the last few days, because where I live, we've been told that we can't leave our homes except for vital, like maybe to get groceries or something like that. Otherwise, we're supposed to stay sheltered in place. And the way that we're functioning is, I don't see people retreating into just sitting and endlessly scrolling their Facebook. What I see is people going out for more walks. I had one friend suggest to me, a friend from Washington suggest to me, hey, let's do Zoom happy hour. So then I thought, well, okay, I'll multiply that. So I invited some other friends from around here for another Zoom happy hour. So 7 nights this week, we're going to have Zoom happy hour at our house. So we're going to actually be more connected than we probably would have been otherwise. More personally connected in terms of talking with people, spending time in real conversation, instead of just sitting and scrolling Facebook or sitting and scrolling Twitter all night, or just sitting and watching TV shows. And I wonder how much that is going to happen with people if they're going to be so hungry for human connection that they start using technology in a new, more productive way. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think that is a possibility. And I don't think so I don't know how familiar you guys are with the model of spiral dynamics.
Tell me.
But a lot of the ways that I think about these things are like in a spiral. I mean, spiral dynamics specifically has to do with collective and individual consciousness, but I think a lot of things work that way. So it's essentially like it's a helix model. So the theory is that collective and individual consciousness works in a repeating circular pattern, but it's not merely two-dimensional. It has a three-dimensional aspect to it. So it's always in this ascending helix. So it's almost it's a bit of a, I don't know, maybe the theory would be that I don't know if that would be like a Hegelian dialectic of like thesis and antithesis type of a thing, but it's just that I think the nature of things, at least you could think of it this way, it's a model, right? All models are false, some are useful, is that things work in this repeating circular pattern where you have like a expanding and contraction, but it has a telos. It's moving somewhere. It's not just a circle. It's repeating endlessly, going nowhere. It's going somewhere. And I think, I mean, as a Christian, I guess my conviction is that that is going to somewhere, which I would say is the reconciliation of all things, God being all in all, salvation, eternal life, new heavens and new earth, whatever, however you want to frame that. Everybody's going to frame it a little differently of how they walk that out, but that's my understanding of the telos. And so technology, I think, also everything, I think, plays into that. I mean, that's just how I conceive of these things to some degree. So I do think technology has is involved in somewhat of that progression where there's going to be, I don't think that it's just universally bad. I mean, there are good aspects of it. There are, like this little corner of the internet, this Paul Vanderklay community, and Peugeot and Vervaeke, and these discussions are good. They're great things. Your Skype happy hour meetups, that's great. That's a better connection than mindlessly scrolling Facebook. But yet I think it's all about degrees, but that's not as good, I would say, as you guys being able to meet in a physically embodied way.
Right. Well, I mean, but that's proscribed at this point. So
Right. But I
So,
wonder how
I want
much.
to go back to something Michael said earlier. Well, actually, the two of you were talking, and Luke, you made a question. You asked the question in your previous conversation. What is the correct way to manipulate the world to our desired ends? And Michael said, well, really, I'd rather change the question and say, what are the ends? And so I thought we could explore that. If we say, if we're trying to think, how do we get to our desired ends? What are the desired ends? And are the ends towards we're working, are they the ones that we desire, or are we somehow being manipulated into desiring something that isn't the best end? And, I think that would be an interesting question to explore.
So I have some initial thoughts on that. I was just thinking about this this morning, and I was gonna record like an audio of my thoughts about it, but I think this is something that Peterson, I think, does a really good job talking about, in that I think our desired ends, we somewhat have to hold in a knowing, unknowing way. Like, I don't think you can completely I think anytime that you really nail down your desired ends in a fully mapped, systematized way, I think that's when things immediately get out of balance. And that's when you get into kind of the McGilchrist lopsided left brain. And then you're really not open to what you're not seeing anymore, which ties into, I think, the nature of technology, because technology maps things out in such a way that it has to do things along a very prescribed way, because that's just what technology does. But that immediately makes it unopen to the thing that's outside of the system. And so what I'd like to connect that with is, is Rene Girard, who I think is he's one of the most essential thinkers, I think, for the meaning crisis. One of the ways that he got into a lot of his theories, he was kind of a polymath. I mean, he was all over the place. He started in literature, was actually in historical, well, what was his exact field? Like a criticism, but broadly it was literature and just the history and anthropology of literature. I mean, he's kind of this guy, he doesn't fit in any one field very well because he kind of transcended all of them. But he one of the things he was doing is he was looking at all these classic works of fiction and novels and things, and he's like, what makes them classics? What is the thing that makes all these things be classics? What do they have in common? And so he started noticing things that get into a lot of archetypes and things of what makes a hero a hero. And I was thinking about this morning, is like, I think there are classic archetypes and commonalities among all protagonists and all antagonists, because this is something that Girard was kind of mapping out, that make books transcendent and makes them work. I think one of the classic hero traits, and this got Girard into the Bible and Jesus and what makes him compelling, is that the classic hero is the one who sacrifices himself for the other. I mean, think of a lot of great works of, I mean, Jesus is this way, obviously. Like most classic works of fiction have, the ones that we find really compelling, or even movies, heroes they're self-sacrificial, right? But then a lot of the antagonists in books are people who are not willing to self-sacrifice, and they're people who want to control and manipulate the world to their ends. They want to change everything else for their desired outcomes. And I was thinking, like, Paradise Lost, Satan in Paradise Lost, that's what he wants, the world to conform to his desires. I was thinking Weston in the Space Trilogy wants the world to conform to his desires, and he wants to colonize the solar system with humanity to promulgate the species for some unknown reason, that he can't even figure out. I had just read Cormack McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and it's such a profound book. I mean, a lot of people equate Cormac McCarthy to like a modern day Herman Melville, of like a Moby Dick almost. They like think he's in that category of like an American writer, and the antagonist in that book is this guy called the Judge, or Judge Holden. And in my book club, you're trying to think about and break apart his book to just be like, what is this character about? What is he trying to do? What makes him so compelling and terrifying in a negative way? And it's that there's some lines, I wish I had them at hand right now, of things that he says, but he essentially says things like, anything, because he's always scrawling in this notebook and recording things in between all these atrocious things that he's doing, but he's just recording all these little, like, tiny things about nature and history. And it's in like the 1850s in the Mexico Southwest US border, and people are be like, and all these undereducated guys, and he's brilliant. He's a brilliant guy. He speaks multiple languages. And they're like, why are you doing that all the time? And he makes some comment like, anything. And again, I wish I had it, because McCarthy's a better author than I am to try to repeat it. But he said something like, anything that remains outside of my knowledge and outside of my control exists without my consent.
Mm. That's
And it's just like
Satan in Paradise Lost, right?
Oh man, it's the same thing. And I think whatever, he's terrifying and he's a compelling character, but Weston has the same thing. So like, whatever that is, that desire to control and manipulate the world to the ends that you think you see clearly, is satanic. I mean, I think it's the opposite of what Christ is. Christ, instead of wanting to control and manipulate the world, in humility gave up everything and destroyed death through death. And I think it's so, and that's where Girard gets into like his idea of Antichrist, is whenever you start getting into like a Judge Holden Weston spirit, but doing it within using Christian language, that's antichrist. And that's Girard's big ideas. There isn't it's very much like the book of Hebrews. There isn't Christ has leveled the playing field. Jesus leveled the playing field. There is only Christ and antichrist. That's all there is anymore. Like, you're either acting in accordance to Christ or antichrist. And the deception is, I think, is that very often you can use Christianese and Christian language in the spirit of antichrist. So I don't know. I mean,
well, let me throw something in here. And this is going to be one of those things that's very hard to talk about. I'm going to be very conscious of Anselm in the comment section because I don't want to say anything that's heretical. Because I love Jesus and I don't want to be saying anything that's wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
But when you just quoted this, and this might not be a perfect quote, but it's the general idea. Anything that exists outside my knowledge exists without my consent.
Yeah.
But earlier we had made, or I think maybe you made this comment, Luke, in your earlier video, that everything that exists because of God. Anyway, I mean, right now, we are in Him. Everything holds together in Him. He is in, not in the sense of pantheism, but we are held together by Christ. That's what the Scripture says. And so, in a sense, Christ has all knowledge, but it's obviously not in the same sense that Satan makes a claim to having all knowledge. And I wonder if there's not something about the idea that Christ shares with us this creative potential, but Satan is not willing to share anything that he has. So let's say that all truth is in Christ, but he shares with us the, okay, let me step outside the picture.
What he shares with us is his spirit to discern that truth.
Yes, and as we are part of his body, it's like distributed cognition. It's this whole idea that you were talking about, Michael, with the democratization of knowledge through the internet. The original idea was this open sourcing, and that's also the beautiful idea of a truly free market, is that the market operates based on the sovereign individual making decisions, and that all these sovereign individuals together, honoring each other and making decisions as a whole, are going to make better decisions for the market than any one centralized body would be able to make, because that centralized body cannot possibly hold all the information that's necessary to make that many distributed decisions. So I don't know if any of that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I think it's directly related to TechnoBabel as well, because again, part of what happened, there's a complexity that is hidden with the lie, again, and there's the arrogance of thinking, again, I can introduce this kind of wrinkle into the fabric of things. I can send it off into the world. I'll know the truth and I'll know the lie, and I'll be the deception that I've introduced won't affect me. And it simply isn't true. It gets woven into the fabric of everybody around you, but even more so, it becomes a part of kind of your physical being, because most of what you do right now, you're doing because of something you did in the past. And so the lie you tell today necessitates a million lies in the future. And once you've gone around that circle X a number of times, it's indistinguishable from, the truth in terms of how you even see and interact with it. It is the truth for you. And so you're, and I think this is why, Peterson always focuses on, always try to tell the truth, or at least not lie. And again, there's this certain humility built into that, of which there's this concept of the truth as this infinite gleaming thing that we don't have access to. I can't ever know for certainty, in some sense, that I am telling the truth, even when I'm trying to, even when I'm trying to be vulnerable and honest with, my fiance, and we're talking, and we're in the most intimate moments, there's still things that are pulling me, off that course of being truthful, that I'm, as much as I'm trying to fight with them, they may be still doing that effectively, because I've practiced a certain modes of being for too long to even notice them or correct them. But we can notice, you can always notice and take note of the conscious lie. And in doing so, and turning away from it, there's something that necessitates, in turning away from that, you turn to something else, and there's a certain muscle you're engaging with when you do that will have, again, if you practice doing that over time, you'll start to see other lies you've told, that you're like, oh man, now I remember the real motivation for why I think this way. And so there's two elements there. It's the complexity, but it's also these circles that we live in, these habits that we go through, and also the influence that those habits have on everybody around us.
Yeah, it's habits. That I think is really, so one of the bigger, and I was saying this to Michael in our talk, one of the bigger people, I think, that was kind of at the beginning of me starting to articulate and formulate technological babble was Rupert Sheldrake. And he talks a lot about habits. That's what his whole idea of morphic fields, that's what they are, is habit and memory and instinct, really, is another
kind of
way
like spirit.
Yes, very much so. So he was, and this is before I even knew Rupert Sheldrake was a practicing Christian, and had all this background. But he talked a lot about these ideas, and you could almost think of that in psychological terms of a collective unconscious, or even a mystical body of Christ. There are spiritual mystical bodies that have, just like our bodies have. We have biological habits, but there are spiritual habits that are part of mystical bodies that are bigger than us, collective bodies, and the body of Christ. And so I think this is the part of the difficulty with all these conversations and technology and the spiritual realities underneath things, is that a lot of our knowledge, this is something I really went into with my conversation with Tripp, is one of the other big players in this whole conversation, I think, is, well, there's the three people that I think of, but Michael Polanyi, Esther Meek, and Drew Johnson are kind of it's a 3-generation of people that talk about the effect of habits and liturgy on our embodiment. And so they'll use the idea of, and I've maybe talked to you guys about this, of subsidiary focal integration. So you focus on, in order to do any task, you have to focus on subsidiary parts of the broader task that you have to learn habits for, that then, and Jordan Peterson talks about this, that then you build neural pathways in the back of your mind. So you focus on things in your prefrontal cortex, these little habits. So you could take riding a bike or even playing a guitar, where you just repeat patterns over and over and over, and you focus on it with your frontal cortex focusing. But then once you build the habits and you train it in your actual body, your hand, and neural pathways within your mind, it moves from a consciously focal thing to a subconscious thing. So then you can do these things without thinking about it in your prefrontal cortex. But then what that allows you to do is focus on other things in your prefrontal cortex, and that builds. So like you get this habit, you get this habit, and then all of a sudden, we were unable to do that, you actually could never get to the point of strumming, moving this hand at different points, finger picking, and singing at the same time. But human beings can do that to crazy degrees. Like I'll send you a video of this guy that I love who like, it's a awesome kind of folk song, but he's like playing two different kinds of percussion with his feet. He's doing two different things with his hands, and he's singing also while kind of dancing at the same time. He's doing like a one-man band. But like you can't do that without subsidiary focal integration. And this gets into and like that's what allows you to drive, it's what allows you to ride a bike. And I think once you kind of get that as a tool, as a heuristic of understanding how we are, that's most of our knowledge. Most of what you do every day is habit and instinct. Like I don't know what percentage of it, 99.9. I mean, that's what most of it is. But that's not, so most of your knowledge isn't this focal propositional knowledge. It's habituated things that put you in spiritual, that I would say also participate in larger spiritual bodies, for lack of a better term, you know?
So one thing to
go ahead.
point out there in terms of like this spirit, right? That let's think of it as the interaction between your habits and our memory and all these other different components, the fullness of my physical being, you know, and the ways that interact is the kind of spirit of whatever. So, or this collective consciousness that you mentioned. So this collective consciousness, coming back to TechnoBabel, is also making its way into all the technology around us.
Yes.
And one of the interesting things about this technology is that technology takes a certain oomph to get it into its place. There's a certain degree of effort and technical detail, but once it's in that place, it can be kind of difficult to move. It becomes kind of rough and hard relative to us. We're much more malleable and changeable in a lot of ways. So what ends up happening is we have these mistakes, we have these lies in our consciousness. They get built into the technology we use, which kind of magnifies and kind of codifies them and ensconces them in a sort of negative. In some sense, they could easily be fixed, even easier than the things in us, because you could just go look at the code and go, oh, let's go fix it. But the problem in practice, there's so much of it and it's growing so fast that nobody ever, I write the code, I don't have time to ever come look back and look at it again because I'm on to the next project.
Right.
So again, these lies get built into this technical reality, which then, because now that it's codified there, it's a hard thing that we as humans have to mold ourselves to. So we become more molded to it, because we can be malleable. Like, like my patterns and routines, can be molded to all the different ways in which I'm addicted to my smartphone, much more than it's much more effort and laborious detail for those updates that go into the software in my phone. But for me to change my schedule, I can be nudged by degrees very quickly into a whole new habit of lifestyle of doing different things that that again are enacting this whatever this spirit is that we've brought into the technology to begin with.
So here's an idea I just want to throw at both of you, and I'll try to be quick and succinct about it. But this is Neil Postman, I feel like, has talked about this a lot, of like how everything has become so technologized, and or Rupert Sheldrake will say this too. It's one of his fundamental tenets of what he calls scientific dogmatism, is that one of the fundamental assumption is a mechanistic assumption about the nature of reality. We think, we almost, and it's funny, it's in our metaphors, it's in our language. It's almost hard for us to come up with metaphors or illustrations or anything that isn't mechanistic. It's colonized I would say our consciousness to a large degree. And so one of the, maybe lost where I was going to go. One of the, shoot, I lost it. Never mind.
Well, that's okay, because I think it ties into what I was thinking about. So I was thinking about this whole thing of abstraction, because Michael, when you were talking about computer languages, and even here now where you're talking about things being built in at layer by layer, the lower layers have some lies or mistakes built into it, but we have to deal with it because we can't go back and fix it. It's already there. It's this implicit bias that's built into the system.
Right. And it
And
takes all
what
this concentration to put it into place. And then once that moment is past, we never come back to it. We never revisit it.
Right. So over time, we've developed this increasing capacity to abstract. And one of the things that Jordan Peterson talks about in Maps of Meaning, I'm just going to read a little bit here because I thought this was so important. He says, once a procedure has been encapsulated in image and particularly in word, in one way it becomes easier to modify experimentally, but it also becomes easier to casually criticize and discard. This capacity for easy modification is very dangerous because the capacity to abstract, which has facilitated the communication of very complex and only partially understood ideas, is also the capacity to undermine the very structure that lends predictability to action. So we have a capacity to abstract with technological language and to build all these data compressions and all of these, in a lot of ways, this whole subsidiary focal integration paradigm that you were talking about, Luke, is very similar to the way that we compress data into symbols that lodge in our brains and then can open up with, oh, this story or that story, or, you know, we have all of that. But I was wondering if it wouldn't be interesting to contrast abstraction with mystery. Because mystery, abstraction is getting further and further away from the reality. Mystery is also separated somehow from reality, or maybe mystery is the reality.
How about I take on abstraction and Luke takes on mystery?
Okay.
The way I see abstraction is it's a way of hiding complexity. It exists to go up a level, a meta level, where now I can have at least a pretense of architecting the way these things beneath interplay with one another. And we're doing it all the time. You know, it's a kind of essential function of being human. You know, again, what is a human? In some sense, I'm this story, right? And that story itself, in some sense, is an abstraction, right? That has all these lies built into it. So, and there's a weirdness where we need the abstraction because we need to obscure some of that complexity, or we become completely overloaded. We can't process the amount of data we're exposed to. But the more successful we become with those abstractions, the more disconnected they are from the lower levels, that they're intended to help us put us in touch with the underlying complexity that's always there.
Yeah, I think that's really good. So mystery, one of the ways that I was trying to think about it was mystery. I don't think mystery has to be I would almost frame it, I guess, this way, is mystery and abstraction are just, they're almost different ways of being in the world. They're just like mystery, I don't think is necessarily when people talk in mysterious terms or say like that's just a mystery, or it's a mystical thing, I don't think people aren't denying that something is in a way knowable. I think they're just denying that it's knowable in a Judge Holden way, in like a something existing without my consent kind of a way. It's when you live in a mystical world, it's almost the difference, I think, of what like Gregory of Nyssa was getting at with his quote of like, salvation is a process of moving from having to being. I think Judge Holden and Satan in Paradise Lost I think they view reality in a way of, and knowledge in a way of having, where I think when you live in a world of being, it's inherently mystical, which doesn't mean, this is why I think it's hard to describe to people what I'm trying to get at, but it's almost a fundamentally different way of perceiving reality.
That I think that's something that's really key. It's happening. It's a real experience of consciousness, but it's not. It's to encapsulate it and communicate it, it's very difficult. What I was thinking of is, Pajot, when he talks about the feminine. In some sense, to articulate the feminine is to um, undo it, right? Like it's not meant to be articulated. I mean, to some degree it can be, but he says he always wants to give a place for it in his art and in his
Yeah.
discussions, but in some sense it always is going to be the space, the mystery, the thing. In some sense, if you pretend that you've articulated it, you've done everybody a disservice. So he kind of like, it's something you have to tread on carefully, and it is something to do with I don't know. It makes me think of too that the subjective and the objective coming together in a moment where something's aligned. I don't know that it's you can embrace it as a way of being, but you have these moments where you see something, you experiencing something, like all these different elements of your consciousness align such that you have a view into something else, and you have an experience of something you can't deny. It's real, and it's compelling. It leads you in further, and so much life would be not, there would be nothing worth living without that element, that sense of being open, being able to open a door and not know what's on the other side of it. Nobody, you would never like, if every story you were listening to, you knew the ending already.
Right. Or in a relationship, like if you were in a relationship that 100% of the time mapped onto your map, you'd hate it. You wouldn't even want to be in the relationship. It would be utterly boring to you. It would be the difference between a picture and an icon. A lot of this really gets at what iconography is that it's a portal into something infinitely complex. It's an image of something that's infinitely complex.
Yeah.
And I think this is why I was just thinking about this morning, because I got into every once in a while there's a few different people in this little corner of the internet that are consistently annoyed with me, and a lot of it I think has to do with the difference between I was thinking about this, both and versus either ors. And I think the kind of mind that really likes either ors is the Judge Holden mind. It's just like if excuse me, if reality maps on to my map, and I can put this in this camp and this in this camp really clearly, and I can just organize the world within my maps, that makes everything really easy. But things that are inherently mystical and mysterious and infinitely complex, I think there's a way of being in the world that isn't. This is why I really love Trinitarianism, that video, and this is something I keep thinking about all the time, like the differences between monistic religions, which would be like forms of Buddhism, where they say like essentially everything is one, pantheism, and that it's all everything is ultimately like what are they is what's the word is not real. Like everything's ultimately an illusion, and non-existence is everything is one. And then you have dualism, which is either or. There's good, bad, light, dark, black, white, dualisms, where like which I think a lot of Christians are really in that camp. That is the world of having, I think. It's the either or world. But Trinitarianism is something that's different. It's completely different. It doesn't deny hierarchy. It doesn't deny good and bad. It doesn't deny day and night. But Trinitarianism, I think, is able to have day and night like two halves of a whole, but also a day. It has unity amidst diversity. It has multiplicity, but also oneness. It has Trinitarianism allows you to live in a place of having hierarchy and knowing how to interact with your world, having love, having otherness, but also having transcendence and immanence at once. And I don't know.
I
Go ahead.
really like that, and it brings me back around. Maybe we'll finish up with this because I do need to go in a couple of minutes. I don't know if you guys ever read. I've been promoting a lot this essay by N.T. Wright that was in the February issue of First Things. It was called "Loving to Know." Did either one of you happen to read it?
Yeah, I read it. I loved it.
Yeah. So he talks about knowledge as this relational experience, and that all knowledge ultimately comes out of love, and that God is placing out in our perimeter knowledge for us to find, sort of. Jordan Peterson talks about it being this little glimmer that's out in the future in front of you that you follow, this little interest path that you follow. And I think it's the same thing that N.T. Wright is talking about, that this knowledge is there. And as we take in that knowledge, if we take it in with the loving gaze, with this idea that when you love something, you look at it differently, you approach it differently, and you accept it and absorb it differently. And, so anyway, I want to go back and reread it again, because there's something there to me about this whole thing, that mystery is the way we're supposed to be able to live in this world of mystery and hold it loosely and live in it with appreciation and love. And what we have a tendency to do instead is break knowledge into explicit and implicit. We bring it in and we think of it as something, I have this explicit knowledge now, and now I'm going to, and this just happens subconsciously, I guess. It becomes implicit, and it becomes part of our subsidiary focal integration and moves into the back of our mind somewhere. But if we break it just into explicit and implicit, we're leaving out the space of mystery. So maybe that is another trinity that's going on there, is that there is the mystery knowledge, and then there is the explicit knowledge and the implicit knowledge, and all three of those are a part of who we are.
I think when you said love, one of the things that makes me think about is I think you can conceive of love in all these different levels or layers of love, from the trivial to like the highest. And one of the things that transpires the higher up you go is a union between the lover and the lovee. Like there's a change that takes place between the two. There's it's relational, like you said. There's and some, you can't know a thing without it deforming you, changing the shape of you intimately. And the more intimate you know it, the more it becomes a part of you. And in some sense, you also have a responsibility for the thing as it comes into you as well. That changes.
Oh, I
And I
really
think,
like that. You can't know a thing without it deforming you. It's like what Jordan Peterson was talking about when he says, um, that when we learn something new, we have to, the old me has to dissolve and then be reformed into the new me that has this new piece of knowledge. So all of life is really this deforming and reforming as we take in more and more knowledge.
Yeah.
And this goes back to what you were saying about you are what you eat. So we are what we eat physically, but we are also what we eat spiritually and intellectually.
mhm.
And I want to abide by that today and not spend my entire day taking in all this terrifying news that's on the internet, and instead spend my day taking in knowledge that's going to deform me and reform me into something new and better. So
One quick
Yeah.
thing, Luke had mentioned seen iconically, and I think that the flip side to that is idolatry, which is why I think this is a really great book, Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield. The subtitle of it is A Study in Idolatry.
Yeah.
And I think what's the distinguishing line between those two things is whether you are practicing this love or not. Because when you take something into you all the way, you become intimate with it, and it again, it deforms you in such a way that your model of it can't exist any longer, right? Like the thing I see on the horizon, that's this little thing. I have this little thumbnail sized image of it that doesn't really represent it. And as I get closer and closer, I get this higher and higher resolution. And at some point, there's a point at which it comes into me, and all my models of it are like exploded at that point once it's actually passes some certain boundary in the loving process. And I think that's how you know whether you're doing the iconic thing or you're engaging in the idolatry.
Yeah. No, I agree with that completely. That's one of the way that I like to say it, and it's very much you are what you eat, is that idea of, and what both of you were just saying, is Eucharistic knowledge. Like, I think that's one of the best ways, but it can't be, it can't be something that you hold at arm's length either. It's got to be something that fundamentally changes you. I was going to go try to find it, but there's this line from this book, The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene, where there's a dad in it who's describing looking at his daughter, who's kind of rebellious and different, and he doesn't understand her, and she's strange, and he has fears about her, but yet the way that he describes this father and he's essentially giving you like his internal monologue as he's viewing his daughter, who's just kind of this somewhat enigma to him, but yet he ends it up with just this like really warm feeling of affection and love for her, even though it's amidst all this fear. And I looked up the shorter quote. I mean, it's really good within the whole context of it, but I looked it up, and it says something like, he's looking at his daughter and he says, "You cannot control what you love. You watch it driving recklessly toward the broken bridge, the torn up track, the horror of 70 years ahead." And then, so that's like just the shorter quote. But then I think in the book, he goes on to say like he looked at her or something, and he was at peace or content. It's just this beautiful, it's just like this beautiful illustration of what I think love is it's and I think we see this most in God, in Jesus Christ. This is why Jesus is such an enigma to everyone: Christian, non-Christian, people in camps, people that think they really understand him, people that don't, people that know him very well, who have this ongoing relationship with him. He is still this crazy mystical guy that is really, really hard to figure out, because his love is utterly compelling and winsome and hard, but yet simultaneously tender and soft and completely non-coercive. And it's just, there's nothing like it. And I think that's what that's what I want of Christianity and of Christians, is for us to live into that spiritual body, to live into those spiritual habits. And I don't, when you get in the spirit too much of whatever exists outside of my control exists without my consent, you can't live in a spirit of Christ. You just can't. You're going to be endlessly fighting with people over control.
Mm-hmm.
So
let's live into that this week as we go out into our worlds. And thank you guys so much for the conversation.
yeah.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. See you later.
Bye.
Bye, guys.